We are talking today with Naomi Klein. Naomi Klein is an award-winning journalist, syndicated columnist, and author. She writes a regular column for The Nation and The Guardian that is syndicated internationally by the New York Times Syndicate. She is the author of several books, including the international bestseller No Logo, taking aim at the brand bullies, which has been translated into 28 languages with more than 1 million copies in print. Fences and Windows, Dispatches from the Front Lines of the Globalization Debate, published in 2002. In 2004, she released The Take, a feature documentary about Argentina's occupied factories, co-produced with director Avi Lewis. And she is here to talk about her new book, The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism. If you would begin, start out and tell us what was the motivation in writing The Shock Doctrine?
I think the basic motivation was to better understand the post 9/11 landscape, and I guess I felt that those of us on the progressive side of the spectrum had lost our bearings, and there was a lot of great activism going on opposing various wars, various extremist policies of the Bush administration. But I felt that there was something lost if we think back to what was going on before September 11th and the huge demonstrations against corporate globalization here in Seattle, Washington, Genoa, around the world. And what I thought was important, I was very much a part of that movement. I was also, a little critical of the summit hopping. But what was important about it to me was that you had this international convergence and this very, militant movement that was talking about systems, was talking about economic systems. It wasn't just about, one political party versus another, and it wasn't just about a handful of politicians. It was trying to look at the common threads that crossed borders, crossed parties, and identifying what those threads were: privatization of everything in sight, deregulation in the interests of multinational corporations, regulation in the interests of multinational corporations, cuts to those aspects of government that help people directly, healthcare, education. That's what brought people together in those massive coalitions. It was identifying the institutions that were globalizing this extremist ideology. And I really felt that after September 11th, partly out of fear of, being labeled anti-American or being associated with terrorism, or just simply because we were in, a state of horror at the belligerence of the Bush administration, and it just became a sort of urgent matter of stop the next war now. I feel like we stopped talking about systems, and I wanted to get that conversation, do my part to sort of get that conversation back, because I really do think that that's when deeper change happens. You can trade the people in power all you want, but if you're not talking about the systems underneath, you're not going to have that deeper kind of change. And I think people feel that. They feel that now in this moment, after the midterm elections and just all the energy that's gone into electoral politics. There's a bit of a sort of hangover now of just wait a minute, was that the right strategy? So I guess that's the deeper motivation for why I wrote The Shock Doctrine. And in terms of developing the thesis, it was based on the reporting that I have been doing for the past 5 years. Starting in Argentina, really with the film that you mentioned, with The Take, where we were in Argentina when this economic model was rejected by the entire country, and you had all these experiments emerging at the grassroots. That's what our film was about. But I was also in Argentina when the war in Iraq began. And I think that the roots of this book come from this experience of watching the war in Iraq through a Latin American lens. It really looked very different from that perspective. I think I probably wouldn't have written this book if I had been in North America when the war began and had been watching the war from that vantage point. It was two things, really, in terms of watching the war from Argentina. The first was this feeling that, and I wrote this at the time in one of my columns, that free trade light, the idea of wrestling new markets through negotiations at trade summits, which had been the focus of the so-called anti-globalization movement, that model had failed, that there was simply too much opposition to it around the world. And Argentina was this dramatic example of it, because here you had this country where there had just been a national uprising against these policies, and 5 presidents had been overthrown in 2 weeks. So there was this feeling of, because it's no longer possible to impose these policies peacefully, they're now being imposed violently. And watching Paul Bremer go into Iraq and just declare it the widest open free trade zone in the world, there felt like there was some kind of connection. And then the other part of it was listening to my Argentinian friends say about what was going on in Iraq, this happened to us. And what they were referring to was what happened in the 1970s in the southern tip of Latin America, Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, where there were a series of coups, violent coups, and brutal regimes were installed that engaged in Argentina in systematic disappearances. 30,000 people were disappeared, and it was in that context of extraordinary violence that you had the first laboratory for this radical form of capitalism that I was referring to earlier: total privatization, deregulation, cuts to government spending. In that part of the world, it was imposed by a group of economists known as the Chicago Boys, who were Latin American economists who had been trained at the University of Chicago in the 50s and 60s. So that's really the roots of this book, of trying to understand and challenge this idea that this radical strain of economics, this radical vision of the world in which the market controls everything, corporations control everything and have total free reign. It's a challenge to the idea that this triumphed democratically and peacefully. So that's where the book comes from.
So where does the concept of the Shock Doctrine come from? Who started that?
Well, I came up with the phrase, the Shock Doctrine, to describe a philosophy of power that emerged out of my research. And the philosophy of power holds that the best time to push through these radical pro-corporate policies is in the aftermath of a disaster. I'm also calling this same phenomenon disaster capitalism. You have a shock. It could be a war. It could be a terrorist attack. It could be a natural disaster. It could be a massive economic meltdown, but something that sort of rewrites the DNA of a country, that just pushes it completely off its off its bearings, and a moment opens up where there's a window of opportunity where people are so disoriented, so confused, so panicked that you can push through policies that you wouldn't normally be able to implement very rapidly, and this very rapid transformation is often called economic shock therapy by economists, because it's sort of a policy tsunami. It's everything all at once. Now, I knew about economic shock therapy, and we've heard that phrase used in the context of the former Soviet Union, Poland, Latin America. I'd also heard it, but I didn't understand that there was a connection between a prior shock, that sort of softens up societies to prepare them for the economic shock therapy. And where we see that most clearly is Iraq, right? Because you've got the war, which was called shock and awe. I mean, it was a military campaign designed to totally overwhelm and disorient the Iraqi population. And then you had Paul Bremer coming in with Baghdad still burning, pushing through an economic program that Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, described as the most radical dose of economic shock therapy that had ever been attempted anywhere. And I was in Iraq, in this period and of sort of an extreme country makeover, and so I saw it happen there. But the idea of there being a shock doctrine, that this was more than a one-off in Iraq, of following a major shock with economic shock therapy, came but when I saw this pattern repeat, it happened after the tsunami that was so devastating in Asia on Boxing Day 2004. After that terrible tragedy, which killed hundreds of thousands of people in the region and displaced millions. In several of the key countries that were hardest hit, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, Thailand, India, there was a concerted effort, in some cases a very effective effort, by local politicians, national politicians, working with international agencies like the World Bank and the IMF to use the chaos after the tsunami to once again push through this same set of policies that would have been, that was impossible otherwise. And I went to Sri Lanka and I reported on this and found that actually a few months before the tsunami hit, there had been national elections. And the political party that was the right-wing political party that had been pushing this privatization agenda had been ousted, had been pushed out of office. And there was a center-left coalition that had come to power promising to stop. 4 days after the tsunami hit, there was a water privatization bill that was pushed forward by the government. Electricity privatization, labor market flexibility. It was the whole package, and it was precisely because people were, they were still burying their dead. They were still, they were worrying about whether they had food and blankets and shelter. They had no ability to respond to this policy onslaught. In fact, most people didn't even know it was happening. And then what was happening along the coasts was that the people who were hardest hit by the tsunami were poor fishing people, were small boat fishing people who had a simple wood canoe and lived off the sea and had huts on the beach. Hundreds of thousands of small boat fishing families were transported to inland camps in the name of safety. They said, we're worried another tsunami will come, so it's too dangerous for you to rebuild along the coast. Meanwhile, when I was there were hotels going up everywhere, all along the coast. So really what it was a massive land grab. And it was in that context, 6 months after the tsunami hit, that I first used this phrase, disaster capitalism, to describe this phenomenon. And then a month later, the levees broke in New Orleans, and there were Republican politicians, I quote one at the start of the book, saying we couldn't clean out the housing projects, but God did. And real estate developers in New Orleans saying, while the city is still flooded, well, this is a clean sheet, and on that clean sheet, we have some fantastic opportunities. That's Joseph Cannizzaro, who's one of the wealthiest developers in New Orleans. And it was the same thing I heard in Iraq, this sort of year zero idea, let's start over, and this sort of welcoming of these horrific events, these terrible disasters, and this strange confusion between destruction and creation, right? Think of Condoleezza Rice as Lebanon is being bombed, saying it's birth pangs for a new Middle East. There really is some fundamental confusion going on here between what is destruction and what is creation, because I've interviewed so many people who mistake destruction for creation, and see these horrific events as moments of pure possibility, precisely because the population is blasted out of the way and can't participate. So what is revealed in these moments is a profoundly anti-democratic impulse at the heart of this corporatist crusade, which is a fundamental challenge to the story that we're told so often, which is, capitalism and democracy go hand in hand. So the Shock Doctrine is a challenge to that idea, and I challenge that idea in their own words, by using the words of the policymakers and the corporate leaders who welcome these disasters because they immobilize populations, which is frankly the most anti-democratic impulse you can imagine. Any political movement is going to take advantage of a crisis, is going to try to, use a moment where there's a possibility for real change, for fundamental change, to put forward their agenda. But I'm talking about something different. You can use a crisis to have a more democratic society, to have a more inclusive society, which is really what the New Deal was in the United States after the market crash in the 1930s. That is not that's really the opposite impulse of what I'm describing, of taking a crisis and using it to bring more people into the political process, to build a more equitable, more democratic society. I'm talking about people who see a crisis as an opportunity to exclude people, to build a less democratic society. In fact, to take advantage of the fact that they can claim that democracy is impossible during a crisis. And, obviously the most committed shock doctors are, the Bush administration, who so expertly harnessed the shock of September 11th to shut down debate about pretty much everything in the United States when it came to foreign policy. I think what we understand less is that they used the concentrated power and the suspended civil liberties that they managed to push through in the aftermath of September 11th. To not just pass the Patriot Act and not just get a blank check to invade Iraq, to fight the war on terror however they chose, but really to launch a new economy. And this economy is the war on terror, because this is a hollow war, which is to say that it is a war that has been entirely outsourced to private players. And we're here in Seattle, so when I was writing No Logo, I had a section of the book on Microsoft and how Microsoft had really pioneered this vision of the hollow corporation that is all sort of brand, but every piece of the puzzle that could be outsourced to the permatemps was, right? Well, Donald Rumsfeld basically took that vision, and this is a man who spent the past 2.5 decades, in the private sector, heading various, powerful corporations, and fancied himself a man of the new economy. He brought that Microsoft model to the Pentagon, right? And he was very explicit. He talks about transformation of the military. What he was talking about was a transformation of a fundamental transformation of who performs the core state function of providing security, and he believed everything should be outsourced. And we're seeing the effects of Rumsfeld's vision now with the extraordinary dependence on Blackwater, where you have this company that's clearly out of control. That is generating enemies for the United States and that country. The Iraqi government wants to throw it out, and the response from the U.S. is, we can't function without Blackwater. So
who are the real engineers then behind this shock doctrine? Who's really benefiting from it?
Well, in the book, I start with the present. I start with an overview of disaster capitalism in New Orleans and in the tsunami affected region in Iraq and Afghanistan, in the United States. But then I go back to the roots of this ideological campaign and trace it back to the University of Chicago in the 1950s and the sort of heyday of Milton Friedman and Friedrich von Hayek. And if we look at who was behind, this crusade, and this was, Milton Friedman was very clear about his vision for the state, and he thought that the only acceptable role for government was to enforce contracts and police borders, and he positioned this radical school of economics as a counter-revolution against the New Deal, against Keynesianism, and the consensus at the University of Chicago was that after the market crash of 1929, history took a wrong turn. And that's a quote from Milton Friedman. History took a wrong turn. And it took a wrong turn by trying to soften the brutal edges of the market. I mean, let's remember, after the market crashed, you had people jumping out of windows. You had the massive economic refugees. You saw, the brutality of an unregulated market. And there was this populist demand in that context for a more humane market system. So not to eliminate capitalism, but to build a social safety net, to create jobs, to have a more activist role for government, and to have a mixed economy. That was the consensus. And this was tremendously successful, and it was, it carried through, the Second World War and the post-war period, which was a period of tremendous economic growth in this country and around the world, but more importantly, it was a period of redistribution of wealth. This was the period when the middle class really grew very rapidly, and so this was extremely popular in this country and extremely popular around the world. And it was so popular that Richard Nixon, felt the need to declare himself a Keynesian, and it really was impossible for politicians to deviate from this path without losing elections. But it was not that profitable a path for the elites in this country. I mean, I think that it actually is that simple. Somebody referred to Milton Friedman as a class warrior, and he was a class warrior, but of the upper classes, for the wealthiest families in this country, who were tired of seeing so much of their company's income go to their workers. So let's look at the track record of this revolution in the United States, which really began with Reagan. I mean, when Reagan took office, CEOs earned 43 times as much as their workers. When, in 2005, they earned more than 400 times as much as their workers, and that goes up every year. So if we just look at the track record, it really has been a class war. It really has been a revolt of the elites against this redistribution, and the policies of the erosion of the power of unions, the ability to outsource more and more, to use contract work, to have less regulation that costs money and more regulation that makes money, i.e. regulation that fiercely protects all intellectual property rights, the lowering of environmental standards, which costs money, and so on. So who benefits? Well, I think we know who benefits. The story of this economic project of the past 3 decades has been a story of enormous economic disparity, economic inequality. I had the occasion recently to debate Alan Greenspan because he was a guest on Amy Goodman's show Democracy Now!, and Amy invited me on to debate Alan Greenspan. And what's interesting about talking to Alan Greenspan, who really was in many ways the architect of this shift, right? The governments come and go, but Alan Greenspan's been there for 18 years, and it's interesting because he's using this moment to warn the world or warn the markets that there's a looming backlash against trickle-down economics, precisely because there is so much inequality. He's worried. And what was interesting talking to him was that, I asked him whether he took any responsibility for this economic populism, because, that these policies that he advocated so, fiercely, the deregulation and free trade, and also so many of his bubbles that burst and left, working people losing their pensions and their mortgages, their homes, whether he took any responsibility for this. And of course he didn't. He blamed the education system, said inequality was the fault of the education system, and it needed to be deregulated and privatized. So they really only have one idea, I have found.
So in your book, as well as in this great short documentary that you put together called The Shock Doctrine, you actually bring in the idea of what happened at McGill University. Mm-hmm. What's the connection there between that and the economic shock doctrine? Right.
Well, the book looks at 3 different kinds of shock. The first is these huge disasters, these shocks to countries. The second shock is the economic shock therapy that follows those disasters. But I also look at a third form of shock, which is much less metaphorical, which is the shocks to bodies, the shocks of the taser gun and of the police truncheon, and in extreme cases, the shock of the electrode in the prison chamber. And what I look at is, how, precisely because these policies are so unpopular, if you're going to push through this radical agenda all at once, then there is going to be some resistance. And if you're absolutely committed to doing it anyway, then there's going to have to be a strategy for repression of that resistance. And sometimes the repression can be handled just with riot police and a crackdown on strikers and protesters. But if you're within the context of a very highly politicized society, usually it takes more. And as the bookmarks for the book, are Iraq, which is where we see very clearly this intersection between these 3 forms of shock, and it was only after Paul Bremer's radical economic makeover when the Iraqi resistance really took off in large part in response to his economic reforms. I mean, there's pretty much consensus that it was his liquidation of the Iraqi military and civil service that created, so many angry, unemployed people, many of them armed, who went to join the armed resistance. And it was his economic laws that convinced many Iraqi business people, many Iraqi entrepreneurs, that they were going to go out of business if they allowed this agenda to move forward. And many of those business people funded the Iraqi resistance, kept them in ammunition. So as the resistance rose up, that's when the war moved into the jails. That's when torture became a tool of the occupation to try to regain control over the country. And if we go to the first laboratory for this ideology, Chile and Argentina and Uruguay in the 1970s, the first sort of playground for the Chicago boys, you once again had that third shock, and precisely because these Latin American countries were so far to the left, these policies were so alien and so rejected, that the only way that they could be implemented was with this extreme use of state terror to terrorize the population, which is what torture does. So that's one of the ways I look at torture in the book, is as a form of enforcement for these economic policies. But I also look at it as a microcosm for disaster capitalism, for what happens when societies are taken advantage of in their moment of shock and trauma. And I do that because as I started exploring the theory behind shock therapy, I read some of the declassified interrogation manuals that the CIA published. The first one was published in 1963. It's called Kubark, and it's a manual for what they call interrogating resistant sources. And it is a manual for how to put a prisoner into a state of shock, which is, in the manual, it's synonymous with the state of extreme regression, a childlike state. That's how shock is defined. The manual starts by saying, all the techniques we're about to describe here are essentially techniques for inducing regression. And I think this idea of regression is really key for people to understand, what the goal is in terms of what the appeal of shock is for shock therapists of all kinds, whether they're economic shock therapists or real shock therapists. It's the idea that you can take adults and reduce them to a childlike state, because children are fearful, and children believe that they're they look to parental figures who will take care of them, So I was reading this manual, and it talks about how to induce regression, how to reduce an adult to a childlike state, and then it says that when this happens, a window of opportunity opens up, a kind of a state of suspended animation, and an experienced interrogator recognizes this state immediately, because the prisoner starts to see the interrogator as a father-like figure, and it is in that moment when they're least able to resist, and when the interrogator is able to extract whatever it is that they want: information, confessions, renunciations of beliefs. And when I read this, it reminded me so much of what I had witnessed after September 11th, where, I'm not arguing that the society was put into a state of shock by the Bush administration. I mean, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but once the shock took place, I think that the Bush administration very expertly seized upon it, also deepened it. Because, the way in which societies become reoriented after a major shock, because a shock really is, all a shock is a gap between an event and an analysis that can explain that event. That's what makes you vulnerable. You're without a narrative. You're without a story. And, that's how we stay sane, we human beings. We have stories that, that explain the world to us. And when something so big happens that is a deviation from our collective narrative, this gap opens up. it is like that gap in the interrogation chamber, and the way you put a prisoner into a state of shock is you completely disorient them. You confuse them between, they lose track of day and night. You mix up the order of their meals. You deliberately create a rupture in their narrative. And that's what sensory deprivation is about. It's about creating that artificially. But this shock, the shock of September 11th, created that collectively. And the Bush administration took advantage of it, in part by really making it sort of forbidden to get reoriented. Because what people wanted to do after that shock was understand it. People wanted to read history. They wanted to understand where al-Qaeda came from, what motivated them. And, the message we got from the Bush administration immediately was, trying to understand this event is treasonous. It is to be with the enemy. Understanding we were told was entirely irrelevant, because everything that happened before 9/11 no longer applied. We were in a brand new world. It was like rebooting history, right? This is the opposite of what people need after a major shock. What people need after a major shock is something that actually connects them to the past, and allows them to regain their bearings. The Bush administration was saying everything you thought you knew is wrong. It's all 9/11, pre-9/11 thinking. That window of opportunity opens up, and suddenly people think Rudy Giuliani is their long-lost daddy, and you saw this regression. I mean, it was quite heartbreaking, really. And of course, we know that the Bush administration took advantage of that vulnerability, that regression, that extraordinary level of trust that they enjoyed in that period, and they used that power to concentrate enormous power in the executive branch. And as I said, they also outsourced that power to a network of their politically connected companies. So that's the other way in which I look at shock and torture in the book, is not just as an enforcement for these policies, but also as a microcosm, or kind of a metaphor for what disaster capitalists do to societies on a mass scale. One-on-one in the interrogation chamber, the interrogator waits for that moment of shock, and in that window of opportunity and in that window of regression, extracts that something from the prisoner that they would otherwise protect. And on a mass scale, on a society-wide scale, what disaster capitalists do is they wait for that shock. And when that shock comes and the window of opportunity opens up, they extract that which we would protect under normal circumstances. Think about New Orleans and the housing projects and the school system and the healthcare system, and how it was all taken from people in that moment when they were least able to defend their interests. So, I'm making a moral argument, and that's, I think, part of what makes people upset about this part of the book, or defensive. Because I think people who push through these economic policies are, might say, well, we can disagree with them, but at least we should respect their good intentions. But I'm not really willing to give them that.
All right. Well, I want to thank you very much for spending time with us today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.